Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Stephanie Desmond, and I'll be the moderator for this expert briefing for the media, which is hosted by Johns Hopkins University. I am also the co-host of the Public Health on Call podcast, produced by the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. Today's briefing will address two topics: yesterday's Supreme Court ruling on New York's gun laws and the pending Senate gun safety legislation. Please note that participants are welcome to use images, video, or quotes directly from the briefing, and that the content is on the record for immediate release. First, I'd like to briefly introduce our experts. Odis Johnson Jr. is Executive Director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Safe and Healthy Schools and a Bloomberg Distinguished Professor of Social Policy and STEM Equity. Johnson is a leading researcher of social inequality who studies school safety practices. Alex McCourt is an Assistant Professor of Health Policy and Management, Assistant Director of the Center for Law and the Public Health, and Director of Legal Research for the Center for Gun Violence Prevention and Policy at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. He examines firearm policy, opioid policy, and other areas affected by the relationships between law and the public's health. Daniel Webster is the Bloomberg Professor of American Health in the Department of Health Policy and Management at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and co-director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Violence Solutions. Webster studies policies and programs intended to reduce gun violence and teaches public health approach to violence prevention. We will have time for questions following the brief opening remarks from each expert. The procedure will be as follows. We will take some questions that have been submitted in the chat and some that were submitted in advance. If you have questions during the briefing, you can enter it in the chat addressed to all panelists. Please specify if you're directing your question to an individual or to the group. Please enter your name, media outlet, and your question. We hope to cover as many as possible. Just a note that participants will be muted during this briefing and it will be recorded. A recording will be made available. I'd like to start with some quick questions on the New York Supreme Court decision yesterday. The Supreme Court decision yesterday from New York, where from each of our experts, what is your hot take on this Supreme Court decision in New York, Alex?
The Supreme Court decided yesterday to strike down an aspect of New York's concealed carry law. And in doing that, dramatically expanded the rights protected under the Second Amendment and set up a new test for courts to evaluate gun policy cases. This has significant implications, not just for New York, but for other states and the federal government with respect to gun violence and other strategies to reducing it.
Daniel?
Yes, this is obviously a very important decision that I think will have very detrimental impacts on public safety based on research that we and others have done to try to understand the effects of state laws governing concealed carry. We can expect that we will see more gun violence following, after laws start to adapt to the Supreme Court ruling. And as Alex indicated, it has implications for other gun laws as well, because the manner in which future cases are determined on guns as it relates to the Second Amendment really now cannot even consider the impacts on public safety that those laws have. So this is deeply concerning to us.
Mm-hmm. This is sounded really scary to someone like me, a layperson. Alex, what are the practical implications of this?
So the immediate practical implication is pretty limited to New York and states that have similar laws. So New York had a law that required anybody applying for a license to carry a gun in public to demonstrate proper cause. And this was defined as a special need to carry a gun in public. It had to be something greater than what a member of the general public would need. So that provision was struck down. as violating the Second Amendment, in part because it was so discretionary. There are a handful of other states that have very similar laws, and so those are likely going to be changed or implemented differently very quickly. States will want to act quickly to avoid legal challenges and having their laws struck down. What this means, though, is that these states will likely still have concealed carry permit requirements. The court recognized that this permitting was okay, it was permissible. The piece that will be different immediately is this discretionary piece.
So this doesn't mean that just anybody can get a gun now.
That's right. This has to do very specifically with public carry. And so it doesn't even mean that everyone can carry in public. There are still standards in New York, for example, that individuals have to meet before they are issued a permit to carry in public. However, this special proper cause requirement is unconstitutional.
Daniel, do you see, you said you saw that we will have more gun violence. So please, what are you seeing today?
Yeah, so as I indicated, probably the most studied type of gun law that we have are exactly what we're talking about today. When states move from the discretionary issuing of concealed carry to what's known as shall issue, what the research has found is that this tends to lead to more violence. It's worth noting that the studies that we have were done with states, with cities that don't have anywhere near the kind of dense population that New York City does, and many of the other cities in the states that will be impacted directly. So what we're talking about is more civilians carrying concealed guns in very densely populated areas. So that's a deep concern.
This sort of, to me, feels like it goes counter to what the Senate has just approved. And so I want to talk, get a quick take from everybody on what the Senate has approved. And I'm going to start again with Alex, if that's okay.
Sure. So the Senate bill is a big deal because the Senate rarely passes gun legislation. This is very rare. And it's a great first step. There are aspects of the bill that are really important and excellent and could have a big effect on gun violence. But it falls short, I think, of what the Biden administration was hoping for and what a lot of researchers might have hoped for.
Is there anything in this new ruling that contradicts what the Senate is trying to do?
There are pieces of it that could be challenged under this new judicial scheme, the new way of approaching Second Amendment cases. There are certain aspects that could be challenged, but the very immediate effect is negligible. The Senate bill really doesn't have very much to do with public carry at all. And so it would only be a future case or future legislation that would threaten it.
Daniel?
Yeah, I agree. Well, just to expound a little bit upon what's in the legislation that was just passed by the Senate. In many ways, this is more of a spending bill than it is a gun regulation bill. It pumps out a lot of resources to address challenges in getting mental health services to the individuals who need it. There are funds that go for school programs to support, emotional health, those kinds of things. So there's a lot of spending there. On the gun side, some of that spending can be used and is specifically directed to states to implement so-called red flag laws. We call them extreme risk protection order laws. And what's particularly important is that these laws are structured in a way that the only way that they can impact gun violence is through effective implementation. So that requires resources. And there is good data right now that when states do have those resources and are acting appropriately, we can interrupt situations such as mass shootings, but actually on a more common level, suicidal kind of situations that are remarkably common. And it's worth noting that The most common form of firearm death in the United States is suicide. So that's very significant. On the regulatory side, for domestic violence battery cases, there's been firearm prohibitors for that. However, the definition has not extended to assaults by so-called dating partners. What this new legislation will do, at least on a temporary basis, would prohibit firearm possession for those individuals. It's worth noting, and to my disappointment, it doesn't extend that same logic to firearm prohibitions connected to domestic violence restraining orders. There, they leave dating partner victims vulnerable to armed and violent partners. The other thing that I will note that I think has not gotten enough attention is the redefining of what it means to be in the business of selling firearms, and therefore one is required to get a license in order to legally sell firearms. That, of course, would require background checks, record keeping, and oversight compliance of those sellers. This is a really big deal. So now the definition is, if you're simply selling guns to make a profit, you must get a license. That will affect a lot of guns that currently now go out with no background checks, no records or anything. So I think that's quite significant. There's also measures that have a very specific crime for gun trafficking that, believe it or not, wasn't in our federal legislation before. So there are some mechanisms and some tools in this law that, even though it doesn't go as far as we had hoped, as Alex indicated, I do think it could have an impact in reducing the flow of guns into the underground market.
Odis, I'm sorry it's taken me so long to get to you. Could you please share?
Sure. I think it's a great question that you started with, Stephanie. I would like to not disagree, but I guess ask the experts about possible unintended consequences or impacts of the decision on the New York case on the abilities of schools to actually maintain safe and healthy environments. I don't know that this decision in any way supports schools in that effort. In fact, I'm thinking about some of the provisions or maybe policy proposals that have been floated in the aftermath of Uvalde, which suggested that we should arm our teachers. And of course, this public carry ruling, I think, makes that even more likely that some states can move in that direction. So there are a number of other policy impacts that this this court ruling might have. And of course, I'm not the expert on that, but it is the question that I have for the experts about how might this support schools in becoming safer and healthier. Now, on to the legislation. Yes, it is monumental that the Senate is taking up anything related to gun control, and I have been advocating for a comprehensive approach to school shooting prevention that isn't overly reliant on law enforcement. So this legislation is a step in that direction. But there are a number of missed opportunities here in the legislation, even though there are plenty of resources for mental health and expanding Medicaid and child health insurance program resources. Those are great and those are needed. There are some ways in which fortifying schools, and it's been documented in research, impinge on other things that are important, including educational outcomes, likelihood of going to college, definitely referrals to law enforcement, and even further down the line, just a healthy life for our next generation. So that is not included within the legislation. There's no interest in equity and there's no interest in racial and ethnic disparities that tends to be exacerbated by steps to fortify schools. So that's where I wish this legislation would go, is that we would think more comprehensively, not only about the safety and security of those environments, but then also be preemptive and forward thinking about the unintended consequences that have been documented at length by research.
Thank you. I have a question from one of our reporters. In light of the Supreme Court ruling, I'm wondering if or how Maryland can rewrite its carry law to pass muster. And I'm going to direct that to you, Alex. And I also saw that, for example, New York State is going to go into a special session to sort of define what spaces guns are allowed and are not.
Yeah, so Maryland is one of the handful of states that has a similar law to New York. Maryland requires applicants to demonstrate a good and substantial reason for carrying a handgun in public. So that is directly on point here. That's the type of provision that the Supreme Court has said is unconstitutional. So the easiest way, the most concrete way, would be to just remove that provision. Now, they also, in advance, Maryland could stop implementing that provision, could stop asking or stop evaluating that on permitting decisions. That's a less concrete step because it can be changed and it might be implemented variably. So the simplest answer is to amend that piece of the law. But Maryland doesn't have to get rid of its permitting requirement. It doesn't have to change other aspects, any training requirements, anything like that. It's more related just to this discretionary piece. And you mentioned New York looking at specific places that guns could be carried or might not be carried. And I think that relates to, Odis, the question you were asking about how this could affect school safety. And that's one really important piece of the decision, is that the court very specifically acknowledges that sensitive places can still, states can still prohibit guns in sensitive places, and that can include schools. Now, that doesn't mean that that will happen uniformly. Federal law right now prohibits guns in school zones, but there are exceptions for those who have a concealed carry license. So states will have to make adjustments. Also, we're talking about school zones. So where does that extend? Where does it start and stop? There will be some more marginal questions where people can carry and where they can't. But ideally, states will still be able to regulate these sensitive places.
Stephanie, I'll just briefly mention that in addition, I think Maryland and each of these states that have to change their laws as it relates to the special need to carry, I suspect that many of them will take a very close look at the general prohibiting conditions. These are things that, like criminal convictions or domestic violence restraining orders, those kinds of things. So I think they'll take a close look to see whether they need to tighten that up for anyone who's going to carry a loaded gun around. And they may also examine whether their safety training requirements are sufficient, given that so many more people are going to be out and about carrying concealed guns.
So I have a question. I've got two questions that are similar, and I'll read them both. I see that the bill's enhanced review provision appears to cover 21-year-olds as well as those younger. Should enhanced review be required for all gun purchasers? And the similar question is, could you talk a bit about how you all view the enhanced background checks for those 18 to 21? Do you think it will have an impact, and how many sales could it affect? Should we start with you, Daniel?
Sure, thanks. So the general idea of in essence, how they define enhanced background checks is simply giving authorities more time to carefully review available records to know with more certainty whether someone has a prohibiting condition or not. That is a fine idea in and of itself. And honestly, our current law seems very deferential to facilitating gun commerce rather than to protecting the public. We've had too many tragic incidents in which individuals have been able to get firearms, even though they're prohibited. The most infamous case, of course, being the tragedy in Charleston, South Carolina, church shooting, and Dylan Roof was able to get firearms. So the general idea, I think, is very sound and advances public safety. The other part of the question, sorry, it was very specifically as it relates to 18 to 21-year-olds?
Right. Yes. Would it be better also? I think part of the question was, would it be better for every person?
Well, it certainly would be better for every person. How much impact it will have on 18 to 21 of this, it'll simply slow the process down a little bit. And one worries not only about assaultive violence, but of self-directed violence and suicides. So I think that could be protective against suicides. But ultimately, someone has to have a prohibitor and the records have to be available. It's a big question now about how much the records will improve in order to identify someone with a serious juvenile offense that would at least temporarily disqualify them from having a gun.
I want to direct the next question to start with Odis. Which part of the Senate package will have the greatest impact in reducing gun violence, and which is the most popular gun control measure that Congress is not enacting?
Well, as far as the gun provisions go, I definitely defer to Alex and Daniel on that topic. But what would make schools most safe, especially within this legislation, are all of the features that focus on internal school safety. And when I say internal school safety, I mean the violence that might be perpetrated by students who attend those schools. There seems to be a doubling down on resources for mental health, expanding those to kids and their families. There definitely is training available, and also a focus on through grants, and also a focus on evidence-based practices in training teachers, law enforcement, to be effective in those situations. So there seems to be this focus on internal school safety, whereas I believe the gun aspects of this speak to those external threats. For example, a shooter coming to the school, gaining entry, and then committing some of the atrocities that we've seen at Uvalde. I'm not so certain that the provisions in this legislation speak to those situations. I think in general, any way in which we can get guns out of the hands of people who would perpetrate those type of acts is wonderful. This is definitely a step in that direction. But I think there needed to be more and more aggressive gun safety provisions in this legislation to speak to the particularities of an external threat to schools.
Before I move to Alex, I've got an extra question that just came in for you, Odis, and it seems like the right time to ask. Would the provisions of the bipartisan Safer Communities Act have prevented the tragedy at Uvalde?
That's a great question, and it's very hard to say because there are so many things that we now know. I hope we know about Uvalde. One was that the shooter did experience some type of bullying or had some other problematic experience in schools. Hopefully, the mental health services that are extended will be extended through this legislation would help that situation. There also are some monitoring and surveillance capacities mentioned in this legislation that would help alert authorities about threats online or something of that nature, and perhaps even the bullying that might occur online that would then lead to the type of distress that I believe that the shooter was in. So perhaps there we find that the legislation may have some impact. But as far as would a shooter be able to access the school grounds, I don't know that the legislation would provide anything more than what was already in place in Uvalde. And yes, I do understand that there were some questions about implementation and compliance, because you have to be hyper vigilant with those security features in order to have them work. So that's definitely something that training can speak to, and redundancy within security plans that might be strengthened or at least supported through the legislation. So that's my answer. I think that the legislation, of course, provides for this, but will it actually stop an active shooter? We'll have to see.
And then, Alex, I wanted to go back to the original question with you, which was which part of the Senate package will have the greatest impact in reducing gun violence, and which is the most popular gun control measure Congress is not enacting?
So I think the most the provision that will have the most effect depends on the type of gun violence we're talking about. There are specific types when it comes to, say, suicide or maybe even mass violence, where extreme risk protection orders or red flags will make a huge difference, and that's especially on these individualized particular bases. But when we're talking about a wider net, a bigger category of gun violence, I think looping dating partners, like protection of dating partners, and including that in some of these domestic violence prohibitions, will have a big impact, especially when it comes especially domestic violence, but we also know there's a nexus between domestic violence and mass shootings. There are many mass shootings start in the home and then spread outwards. And so there's also a potential for a positive effect there. In terms of which policies are popular policies that were not included here, private sale background checks, in particular, requiring a license or permit to purchase, those are very popular policies, and not just among Democrats, but also among Republicans and gun owners. These are policies that are generally popular among the public, but not as much in Congress.
Mm-hmm. I have two specific questions for you, Daniel. One is, are there any recent estimates about how many sales could be affected by the clarification of who needs to seek a federal firearms license? And will it lead to more gun sales being subject to checks?
So in the first part of that question, the answer is no. Of course, it's very difficult just to monitor firearm sales from licensed dealers. Monitoring sales from people who are unlicensed, we don't have a lot to go on. We have some survey data, but usually that's, at least the survey data that I've seen, does not go into the kind of detail about how many guns are you selling and that sort of thing. What we can basically draw upon is, some limited research that either looks at online sellers, which Everytown for Gun Safety has done some research on that, and found that there's a pretty substantial number of individuals who sell a lot of guns advertising themselves as private unlicensed sellers. So I think there's two ways to look at it. One is just the number of sellers, but honestly, it's the number of guns. And so that's why I'm a little bit bullish on the impact of this, because it not only affects a lot of people who are selling a lot of guns. It's the volume of guns that they're selling. So I think, getting to the second part of the question, will this result in more sales being subject to background checks? I would say absolutely. And honestly, just as importantly, I think it will lead to fewer guns being diverted into the underground market or to otherwise to prohibited individuals, because they can't go online and find lots of people selling lots of guns as private sellers, at least if the law is enforced properly. And the same goes for gun shows. Observational research at gun shows has shown some very shocking things of private sellers who seem to have as big as arsenal as any licensed dealer at a gun show, and sells as frequently at those gun shows as a licensed person. So Again, I think this is pretty significant.
And the next question for you, Daniel, is, and this is the last question, the bill allocates $250 million to community violence intervention programs. What impact will that have on gun violence?
Well, I think it will certainly have a positive effect on gun violence. We've been studying community violence interventions, others as well. It's important. I think my own take on this is that there are many success stories in community violence intervention. It's not an automatic that every program is going to be successful. That's very clear. But there's clearly evidence to indicate that we got to expect that those dollars will translate into fewer people being shot and to lives saved. And my own hope, of course, is that with this influx of money, it will really help make these programs more robust, because what we've been evaluating to date often are very under-resourced programs. So it's really important right now, as cities are grappling with surging gun violence, to really build up their infrastructure for community violence intervention, and the federal government putting forth these dollars, I think, is important. The last thing I'll say is my only disappointment in this category is that it wasn't more. It was a relatively modest amount when you look at all the other spending that's in this bill.
So I'd like to thank you all for your takes this morning. I would like to ask each of you if you have any sort of closing remarks, and I'd like to start with you, Odis.
Thanks, Stephanie. I hope that we have a robust conversation about how we achieve secure and equitable schools that do not, in an unintended way, enhance racial disparities, exacerbate referral rates, and begin criminalizing what is otherwise normative child and adolescent behavior. So yes, secure schools, but I don't think we're thinking deeply about how do we maintain educational excellence, because we know these schools that are heavily fortified have lower than average test score performances and rates of entry to college. So there are just conversations that need to happen about equity and also lessening these racial and ethnic disparities that are caused by fortifying schools.
Daniel?
Yeah, I think what I'd like to close with is really, I want to hold up what gun policy or gun violence prevention policy is. In many ways, this federal legislation is a starting point, because it is channeling resources to localities. It is putting other things in play. And gun policy occurs after a piece of legislation goes into signed into law. How will ATF actually enforce the new provisions that they have? We don't know yet. That is gun policy. How will schools use those resources that are being made available? What about the mental health resources? So I think it's really important for us to not sort of say, okay, we're done with this bill, now let's think about something else. Really what happens, what flows from this is incredibly important to determine to the degree to which this will actually achieve the hoped for benefits, that we actually have less gun violence.
And Alex, the last word.
Sure. So I think the Supreme Court decision is a massive moment in gun policy and gun violence prevention, and will lead to a wave of litigation, and probably more laws will be struck down. But I think it's also important to emphasize that the sky is not falling with respect to state and federal gun laws. There's still a lot of things that states can do and are doing to reduce gun violence, and the court decision just changes that a little bit.
So I wanted to thank our speakers for their insightful answers today. So we will email the links to the resources mentioned today and shared in the chat, including a podcast where you can hear more from them. And with that, I'd like to say thank you again to everyone for joining us today. Have a wonderful afternoon.